Lovely. Can everyone hear me? Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me, the Heritage Board of Latvia. I've come here today from Wales, and I represent Cadw, which is the Historic Environment Service of Wales. Just out of interest, who here has visited Wales? Yay! Quite a few people, that's great. I was asked to consider a particular question when I was invited to come here, or rather I should say our director was invited to come here and talk to it, but he cruelly went off on holiday, so I got to come here instead, and I've really enjoyed myself, so it's been fantastic. But we were asked, on the basis of some of the work we've been doing in Wales, to actually answer a question, and the question we were given, linking in with our conference today, is who owns restoration rights? Are they only for professionals, or are there activities that can be performed by owners or volunteers? And I think some of the previous speakers have spoken a bit about this, but I'd like to maybe consider that a bit more. And in my presentation, I'd like to use some examples from Wales to illustrate, I think, changing attitudes, perhaps, within the heritage profession to the role of the public and what they can do in the care and protection of our historic environment. I think the changes taking place in Wales are probably illustrative of broader international approaches to conservation that seek to engage with and involve the public more and more with what we do. We're all looking at the same problems, and I think it's really interesting to bring together our experiences at conferences like this to share what we're doing. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of my organisation, Cadw, in the corner. Just for those who know, in Wales we have two languages. We speak English and we speak our own language, Welsh, and Cadw is actually a Welsh word. It means to care for or to keep. So that's really the purpose of our organisation. And it's our view that there really is very much a role for the public and for volunteers in the work that we do. We believe that our historic environment is a shared resource, that everyone should have an opportunity to participate in caring for it. The role of specialists, like we've heard today, is vital. We couldn't work without them. But equally, we recognise that it is only through the support and the involvement of the public, and in particular, all those historic asset owners and the contractors and in the construction industry who work on them, that we can actually achieve our goals, which is to have our mission statement, if you like, an accessible and well-protected historic environment that we can hand on to future generations. So our approach to the historic environment is very much about trying to encourage the active involvement of owners and volunteers, and to promote within them an understanding of our historic environment and the skills that we need in order to look after it. In my talk, I'm just going to use a few examples from Wales, reflect on the challenges that we face in trying to do this, and maybe give you some examples of how we're tackling all of that. I should just say I didn't put a label on this. This is our castle of Carnarvon. More later. I'll use a few more examples of that. That's one of my favourite sites. But first of all, I thought it might be nice just to introduce myself and the organisation I work for. Fortunately, quite a few of you have visited Wales, so you know where we are, because we're the sort of the little part of the UK, the dark green on the map. We're a relatively small country compared with our nearby neighbours. We have a population of about 3 million against the population of England of about 50 million. So as you can see, we're a little bit smaller in that sense. And this is where I come from. I was brought up in a city called Newport, which is on the right there. It's about 10 miles from our capital, Cardiff. And Newport is very much an industrial city. It developed particularly in the 19th century on the back of industry. But that doesn't mean it hasn't got an older history. We're just a short distance, just on the outskirts of our city, from the biggest Roman fortress in Wales. This is the Amphitheater, which, though it may not be quite as impressive as the Colosseum, is effectively the best preserved Roman amphitheater in the whole of the United Kingdom. It's managed by my organisation. It's one of the sites that we run today. And at the centre of our city is a castle. But what we're really known for is our industrial heritage. Newport developed in the 19th century. It's a port, a dock, and it was from here that all the steel and the iron and the coal from the South Wales valleys was shipped off around the world. Our most famous monument is our transporter bridge. There aren't many left in the world. I think there's only about 12. I don't know. This is where the passengers are on a tiny gondola that just sort of moves gently back and forth. Here's the gondola, just on its way across. The reason we had this is because our rivers are very, very tidal. They go up and down by great distances, and this was the only way that we could keep the shipping going up and down because, well, if you needed to have a bridge, basically you'd had to have had it at the level of the top deck, and you can imagine what road you'd have needed to get up to that. Impossible. So this way you get to have the transportation across the river, but with a relatively modest bridge. And to be fair, Newport is one of those cities, I'm sure you've got them in Latvia, which is looked down on a bit because it's not as beautiful as Cardiff and all these other places. So we are inordinately proud of our transporter bridge because that's one thing that we have that no one else in Wales, or indeed most of the rest of the world has. I think there's only about 12 left. But anyway, perhaps it was inspired by all this beautiful buildings and things like our transporter bridge that I embarked on my career. I have to admit, I'm in a room full of architects. I'm an archaeologist. I went to university in Cardiff to study archaeology. And after that, I went to Cambridge University to do my research, where I actually did work on geophysical techniques. I was one of those people who wanders around with the machines, sticking them in the ground and looking below the surface. My first job was very exciting. It was in an aerial photographic unit in England, where we flew all around photographing the landscapes from above, although I have to say in the bottom right-hand corner, that is a lovely Iron Age hill fort from Wales. And it was during my time with the aerial photographic unit that I became fascinated by the way monuments fit into the landscape and the changes that we see over time, because one of the things we were doing was mapping the changes to monuments. We would take old photographs and we would look at modern photographs and we would see what had disappeared and what had changed. And it was during that I became increasingly interested in those changes and how we managed them. And it was shortly after that I joined Cadw, which is the organisation that is responsible for monument management in Wales. Cadw is, as I said in my introduction, the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service. We are actually a government body. And our mission statement, our purpose, is to work with the people of Wales for an accessible and well-protected historic environment. We work to a minister. Our minister is actually Lord David Ellis Thomas. How British can that be, working to a lord? And he is, I must admit, extremely supportive of our work. Effectively, there are two sides to our business. We manage 130 historic monuments on behalf of the people of Wales. These are the sites that are managed and owned by the state. We conserve them and we make them accessible to the public as, in many cases, very popular visitor attractions. We charge entrance to quite a few of them, and all of the money we get through that process goes into our budget to put back into conservation, both in terms of those monuments and where we give grants to other bodies. We have to have some additional support, but effectively the money we make at our sites all is a really important part of our budget. So actually making monuments accessible is important to us for a number of reasons, not least the fact that it is through that income that we can do the rest of our work. The other side of our business is providing environment advice, historic environment advice, and protecting, designating statutory protection, legislation, the rest of the historic environment. And as you can imagine, much of that is very closely linked, those two sides of the business. And indeed, many of the staff, including myself, work in both areas. The 130 sites that we are responsible for include some of the best-known monuments in Wales. This is possibly one of them. This is the 4 castles and towns that make up the World Heritage Site of Castles of King Edward in Gwynedd, which is in North Wales. This was our first ever World Heritage Site, inscribed way back in the 1980s, and actually quite controversial at the time, well, even now. Because what we're seeing is 4 magnificent castles in Wales, none of them Welsh. These English castles. And they were built in our country when King Edward decided that perhaps he would like to have Wales rather than the Welsh people having Wales. And so when we talk about values, and in particular intangible values, there's quite a lot of loaded values in these sites, because you see those town walls, particularly in the top right corner that encircles the town of Conwy, beautiful place. When those were built, and when that castle, which you see at the top corner there, was constructed, that was so that the English people could be nice and safe in their lovely new town, and the Welsh people, who were not allowed to live inside the town, wouldn't be able to come and get them. Fortunately, the Welsh people were very, very shrewd, and they quickly burnt down the walls and broke in and wreaked havoc, as we do. But it does mean that, interestingly, our first ever World Heritage Site was a site that had some rather deep associations in Wales with this whole conflict, if you like, between ourselves and our neighbours. And I'm sure that's ringing bells in terms of what we put in terms of heritage and what it means to us. But I digress. We have many, many other types of sites. Our oldest are prehistoric monuments. Our most recent are industrial. A lot of our sites, to be fair, are castles. We are known as a country of castles. We've had turbulent history, and it's left us with this wonderful, wonderful legacy of them. Having responsibility for managing these sites, for conserving them, repairing them, restoring them, helps give Cadw the authority, the experience, if you like, to work with others. We can lead by example, and that's always been very helpful for us when we're giving our advisory documents, because we can draw on our own practical experiences. That second side, that providing advice and guidance, is the other half of Cadw's business. Our historic environment branch, which I lead, is filled with specialists who go out really and provide advice and protection to monuments across Wales. This is Carnarvon again, and here we see the town wall there also of Carnarvon, which is sort of quite nice in the foreground. Wales, as every country, has its own unique and diverse character, and this is reflected in the wide range of historic assets and landscapes that we enjoy today. We are rich in history, and this is reflected in these monuments, in these landscapes, in these townscapes that have developed over thousands of years. This is our historic legacy. It's all around us, yet it's very fragile. Once elements have been destroyed or altered, they can seldom be recovered. We recognise that the public has a considerable vested interest in our historic environment. To our eyes, it belongs to everyone. And in the case of the thousands of historic buildings, scheduled monuments, and other designated assets, quite literally. While a few of these assets are managed by organisations established with the object of their care and presentation, the vast majority of them are in public ownership and private use. So it means that, on the most part, it is the public, people, who we have to rely on to care for the vast majority of our historic assets. And to do that, they need to understand and appreciate their value and the benefits of looking after them. In Wales, we actually estimate that in terms of value, economic value, our historic environment sector contributes the best part of £960 million to our economy, so quite considerable. In terms of social value, though, perhaps it is even greater. The historic environment is part of the cultural heritage of a country. It's a source of community pride. It can bring people together. Wales is quite a small country, but we find that our historic assets provide us with an international recognition that we would perhaps not otherwise gain. But to realise those benefits, we need to balance protecting them with access and use of them. These are our headline figures, if you like. The public vested interest in a historic environment is, if you like, the justification for us to place legal protection on it. In other words, to allow the public to have a say in that which is in private ownership. We benefit from over 100 years of heritage protection legislation in the United Kingdom. Many of the systems we operate are mirrored across the rest of the United Kingdom, including the use of different types of designations for different types of assets. For us, historic buildings are listed, and these are defined as buildings that are occupied or capable of being occupied, buildings that should be used, in other words. Scheduled monuments are historic ruins, archaeological sites not capable of being occupied. We also have registers of parks, gardens, landscapes. We've got a few historic wrecks, not as many as perhaps we should have, and we have 3 World Heritage Sites. In addition, we have something of the order of 200,000 records of historic assets across Wales that have not got any legal protection upon them, but are known. So in summary, Wales is a country with thousands of individual historic assets, most in private ownership, only relatively small numbers of professional advisors, mostly working in organisations like Cadw, local authorities, archaeological trusts. The question for us that I was posed, therefore, is not, is there a role for owners and occupiers and volunteers? It's how can we encourage owners and volunteers and occupiers to get involved in the care of our assets? I think one of the first things in this paper was change. Change to assets, the continuum of change. The thing that fascinated me when I started looking at archaeology from the sky, in the right there we have an Iron Age enclosure now completely flattened below the ground. Once that would have been great earthworks visible for miles to see. Now it's completely flattened. A dovecot in the middle, a medieval dovecot. Note here, yes, there we've left a tufty top as well. So it's there you go. I like a bit of soft capping myself. Changes to assets is inevitable. It happens all the time. The natural forces, use, will result in change. And some of that will result in loss of fabric or alteration of the appearance of an asset. That rate of change varies dramatically. The change that may affect an Iron Age hill fort such as this may take over decades, centuries, whereas, as we all know, a building left unoccupied quickly falls into a serious condition and can be lost very dramatically and quickly. We believe that keeping buildings in use, even if it means change of use, as increasingly appears to have to be the case for industrial sites or religious buildings, is the only way to prevent them from being lost, and that is preferable. This does therefore mean intervention, new services, as all the presentations we've seen today, windows, access, partitions, but by recognising the historic values and character of the building, these can be achieved. And we have lots of examples like those we've seen today that we can draw on. The conference title, Restoration, interested me. In Wales, as here I think, you use the term restoration very specifically. We use it very specifically to mean when we are returning a historic asset to a previous or an earlier state. In its purest form, therefore, we don't really do it a lot. Large-scale restoration is quite rare. And under our current legislation, only undertaken on the basis of complete knowledge or complete understanding of the fabric of that building. So without relying on conjecture and therefore not so frequently undertaken. But I thought you might be interested in just a little bit of some historical perspective on that approach and also how it sort of led to our thinking today. This is Carnarvon Castle, as you see it today, nicely maintained. All the towers got roofs on them, looking pretty tidy. And this is its main entrance gateway, which we're currently developing a new project for, because this is the way in. You'll see we have our disabled access ramp that we installed a few years there to the left, because unfortunately, have you noticed, the thing with castles is they tend to be built to keep people out. It makes getting them in when you want to get your visitors in a real nuisance. But anyway, so we've put in this lovely ramp, and this is our great main entrance, again, looking very fine, and that's it from the back. And we're currently developing a project to install new visitor services in there. So, as has been said here, the first thing we needed to do was to understand the fabric of that building much better, its history. And what is interesting about this particular part of the castle, or rather Carnarvon in general, is that it is a really early example of a restoration project that took place in Wales. This is it as it is today. This is it as it looked in 1808. Not much cared for at the time. Most of our castles went out of use after the Civil War in the 1650s, 1660s. So from that point on, they were basically on a trajectory of further deterioration down to various states. By 1808, bits of Carnarvon Castle had a tendency to fall on top of the town, and the townspeople were less than pleased about that and wrote to the Crown and told them to do something. Nothing was done. Then, at the end of the century, it came into the management of a chap called Sir Llywelyn Turner, who was the constable of the castle. And he decided he would start some conservation work there, or restoration work as he did it. In the building on the far left here, you see, he installed a custodian, and he charged visitors 4 pence to come in. And with those 4 pences, he started a project of conservation, resulting in, effectively, the appearance of that tower as we see it today. I like particularly his health and safety approach to ladders. I'd love to see us get away with that nowadays. You can see here this picture from 1911 shows the conservation work underway, and in particular what Llywelyn Turner decided to do was to reinstate the effect of the battlements of Carnarvon that had been lost, if you look back to that old picture. If you see all the way around the top, he had put on his battlements, but he decided to go a little bit further, and he'd added little pinnacles on the top of each one, very artistic. By the 1950s, they'd gone. The Ministry of Works had taken over and had completed the work, but feeling that there was no actual evidence for any of his little pinnacles, had whipped them all off. It's interesting to show that it's a really good example of carrying out conservation, or in this case, carrying out restoration without maybe doing the necessary research, and not something that we do today. I include the picture in the bottom there because this is a rather special year. It's the 50th anniversary of the investiture of Prince Charles, which took place in our castle. It was a very nice moment. And actually, if you were there this time last year, it would have looked absolutely identical, because I don't know if you've seen the television series The Crown. It's very popular in Britain, and they were there filming last year that scene ready for this season, so it was like stepping back in time. Very interesting. This is the study that we've sort of got to with that, where we're trying to identify the different phases of conservation, and in this case, restoration that's taken place over the year. As you say, the first stage of any project has to be developing and understanding. This one is a very interesting project that we'll be taking forward over the course of the next year, and we will be putting information on that online as it progresses. In Wales, there was also a very dramatic piece of restoration carried out in the 1930s in one of our other castles. This is Caerphilly, the sleeping giant, we call it, of South Wales. Actually, the biggest by area of any castle in Wales, I think third biggest in the United Kingdom. And we have to thank the 4th Marquis of Bute. This is one of the, well, he was one of the, I suppose, the founders of Cardiff. He made his money in the coal industry, was, in the 1930s, one of the wealthiest men in Wales. And what was interesting is that he had a passion for history, and he owned this castle. And so, as you do, he decided to rebuild it. But what's particularly interesting about his project, and we see here what he did, which is effectively he rebuilt the inner gatehouse, is that he did it, first of all, because of his love of history, but secondly, because, as you'll see from the dates, this took place in the 1930s, and if you remember, that was the period of the Great Depression, and this hit the Welsh valleys particularly badly. Coal workers and steel workers were basically unemployed and had no source of income, and the Marquis of Bute felt that it was better to give men work than to just give them money. So he decided that he would rebuild his castle and use those workers. So it's an interesting question of the history, if you like, of restoration and the role of different people in it, because this was a public project, if you like. And for that reason, it's interesting that the castle of Caerphilly is much loved by all of the people in the area, many of whom had ancestors, grandfathers, who worked on the project. I should note also it's particularly famous, Caerphilly, for its famous Leaning Tower, the Leaning Tower of Caerphilly, which we would never attempt to write, I think. In the 50s, a second rather dramatic restoration project took place when they reflooded the moat, which is, again, a really interesting project that I often find myself wondering if we'd have the nerve to do nowadays. More recently, and leading more directly to Cadw's own work, our biggest restoration project, I suppose, took place in the late 90s, which was when we restored this lovely Tudor house in the middle of Conwy back to its original appearance. It is a genuine example of a restoration project. One of the things that was most interesting about it was, you see it now with its lovely white render. For centuries, it had had no render. This is its original appearance. For centuries, it had had no render at all. It was bare stone wall. And you can imagine the surprise of the local townspeople when a white render started to be applied all over the walls. It was actually a very interesting learning experience to us because we didn't really think a lot about it. We were thinking we will return the site to its original appearance. Used to have a render, we'll put a render back on, that's the answer. The people of the town went mad. What are you doing? What are you doing to our building? Why are you making it white? What on earth? We had to carry out some very urgent and detailed work with them, explaining our thinking, explaining our studies, showing the pictures that we'd found, the paintings. And I think that was really influential to us in making us think that this isn't just something that we can get on with. These buildings have a resonance and an importance to the community, and they want to know what's going on with them, and they should know what's going on with them. Our work on this led very much to our thinking, as did our work on this project in the other end of Wales. This is St David's Bishop's Palace, a 14th century palace built by the Bishop of St David's next to the cathedral. This is a ruin, and in this case we carried out more, I suppose, what you would call traditional conservation. We didn't attempt to put a roof back on or do anything like that. And again, it was interesting that this project was taking place at a time when there was a change. There's a big conversation going on in the United Kingdom about how conservation should take place. We were rediscovering traditional techniques. We were rediscovering the use of lime mortars and renders as sort of sensitive ways of protecting buildings. And it was the working on these projects that really led to where we are today, I think. In 2011, we published this book, Conservation Principles. I have some copies with me, and it's also available on our website. This is effectively the philosophical bedrock, if you like, of how we think about heritage conservation today in Wales in terms of its protection and practice. It is very similar and links with other pieces of work carried out in other parts of the United Kingdom, and it also draws on a lot of thought from ICOMOS and other bodies. In essence, we distill it down to these 6 principles. And as you will see, I won't read them all out, some of them are very much, particularly the third and fourth, about this idea that the historic environment is everybody's. Experts, professionals, specialists have opinions, have views, have a role to play. But there are also other voices that have to be heard. The historic environment is a shared resource. Everyone should be able to participate in sustaining it, the historic environment. And our book is about how we can try and encapsulate that into a system that allows for these different voices, these different views to be brought in. I would say, to be fair, that this book, which was published in 2011, while it clearly sets out, or hopefully clearly sets out, how we would like the public to be involved in the conservation of our historic environment, I wouldn't say that the book itself is particularly user-friendly. It's really aimed at a professional audience, and when you read it, I think you see it's not necessarily something that everybody's going to be able to pick up off the shelf and make sense of. So a lot of the work we've been doing since has been really trying to put these principles into practice, both in terms of what we do and in how we can actually explain that to the public more widely. In our conservation principles, we define different levels of management and intervention. Similarly to the previous talk, we use many different terms: maintenance, repair, renewal, more words, more terms, archaeological work, restoration. And our heritage protection mechanisms and guidance are really designed to try and encourage and support the public in those areas that we need them to get involved with, in the maintenance, in the management, in the repair, while putting controls on those areas that can be more damaging, if you like, to the historic environment. The benefits of good maintenance speak for themselves, and the projects we've seen today are examples, more often than not, where maintenance has ceased or failed and the problems arise. We encourage, obviously, people to engage with this as much as possible. Most of the activities we class as maintenance, repair, renewal, in other words, the dismantling and replacement of an element with a like-for-like, if you like, replacement, can be carried out by the public and owners and volunteers, and we try to actively encourage it. Most do not require owners to apply for formal consents, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily without any risk to the historic asset. We all know that insensitive repairs can cause damage, and also there can be cumulative effects of lots and lots of little changes that can sort of alter the overall effect on an asset. We try to tackle that. In other words, how do you encourage positive management without the risks of the negative through the production of guidance? Don't try to read this. Just to add to the complexity, it's written half in Welsh as well. So we use it occasionally, more often than not. I think we use this one when we're trying to show people we're doing lots of work and publishing a lot. You know, yeah, look, it's all of this. So we have a very structured system of publication. But in particular, we have a whole suite of them which are very much aimed at the public. They are effectively our core reader, we think of as being the interested, non-professional. I brought some examples. I'm afraid I wasn't able to bring lots, but I've got some examples here. So we have what we call managing booklets. These tend to be focused on different types of assets like listed buildings or scheduled monuments. We have what we call our caring for booklets. These tend to break it down to different types of monuments. So, in other words, this is actually one aimed at farmers to help them to understand the sort of assets they find on their land and what they could do with them. This one is more specific. It's about Iron Age types of sites. And then we have our third range, which we call our care and conservation books. Now, these tend to be aimed at different types of buildings. So this is one on industrial workers' houses, mostly poor quality houses, which need a lot of care and maintenance, and are also one of the principal types of historic buildings that people still live in today. And as I say, we try to aim these. We write them in both our languages. They're all English and Welsh. And we aim them at the owners of those buildings to try to give them an understanding of the building, why it might be interesting, how they can find more about it, and what they can do to look after it. All of our guidance, and in some cases we do give some sort of examples of sort of projects that could be carried out. All of our guidance encourages people to adopt a structured approach, where the first thing we try to get people to do is to understand their asset. Like the other parts of the United Kingdom, we recommend, and we apply ourselves, the Heritage Values approach, which was mentioned earlier. We define the values, the heritage values of a historic asset in their evidential terms, the fabric itself, the monument, the aesthetic values, the historic values, and its communal values. That is a whole presentation in itself, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that approach. It's our current professional best practice, but we think it's something that doesn't have to be restricted to professionals. It is understandable, and it's good to encourage owners to think in those terms as well. Our challenge, therefore, is to help people to think that way, to sort of understand their assets. Fortunately, I should say the first place to start, of course, is information. How do you find out information about your asset? We're quite lucky in Wales in that we have got a very good historic environment information source of a record. Years of funding and research has gone into creating a whole series of databases and information sources, most of which can be accessed online. This is just a little map extract from our own website, where we hold descriptive information on every asset that is a protected asset, every designated asset. And people can go in there and pull out that information, including what it is, where it is, and a description of it. That then links into other websites by other organisations, including the Royal Commission, which is effectively our national archive, which includes photographs and maps and drawings. It's not comprehensive, nothing ever is, but it's a great starting place. And we encourage people to try and use these resources to understand and get to know their buildings and monuments. The other thing, so that really is about our first area, which is encouraging people to know their site, understand it, and care for it as they can, to do their best. I should add that our own branch, the Historic Environment branch, is also always there at the end of a telephone to answer questions from owners and to help to direct them to new sources of information and advice about what they could do next. The other area, which has been really the most focus of this conference, has been about, if you like, taking things to the next level beyond the pure repair, the conservation when you're moving into, say, a restoration or a much more invasive piece of conservation work. This is where, obviously, the role of the professional starts to become particularly significant, because there are techniques and methods that have to be used, and they are going to be the primary source. However, even here, we believe there is still a role for the public. And one thing I've heard many times today, which I found very interesting, is people have said, this project was very successful because the client was wonderful. The client really wanted this to happen. The client wanted us to do this well. And instilling that love of the heritage is how, hopefully, we reach out to those clients, to those owners, and encourage them to be that positive influence on the project, not the ogre in the room who you're trying to sort of fight against all the time. I know we're sort of getting short on time, so I shall skip to this example just to say, this is one of our properties, Castell. It's an unusual castle. This is genuinely, I think, a fairy tale castle. I think you could genuinely imagine Rapunzel sitting up in her tower here. And I just, while I'm on this foot, direct you to the chimneys, which are very long and thin and beautiful. And just to say, this is the interior. This castle is a folly. It was built in the 19th century. It's in a sort of pre-Raphaelite. William Burgess was heavily involved with the construction of this. So it's basically a sort of a very rich man's fancy. In fact, it was the father of the Marquis of Bute's fancy, again. But it's got the most beautiful Aesop's fables around it. Now, the problem is all the interior, beautiful as it is, was suffering badly from water coming down the chimneys, which was coming in through cracks. So we needed to do work here. And this comes back to what I said about the idea of leading by example. Now, this is not a project for anyone, obviously. We had to scaffold this thing, which was a trick in itself, as you can imagine. And then we knew we were going to have to dismantle the chimneys, right down, one piece by piece, repair them and put them back up again. Now, I'm not saying that you can necessarily get the public and volunteers to get involved in this, but what we did do was we opened the entire project up for visits. We offered people the opportunity to come up on the scaffold and to view the work in progress as we dismantled the chimney, as we measured each piece, as we put it to one side, as we repaired it. And we hadn't actually ever thought about getting people up onto quite high locations like this before. We did wonder if maybe that might put people off. We were overwhelmed. We had so many people applying to come on our trips. We had to do extra visits because everybody wanted to see the project in action. It really confirmed to us that there is a real passion out there with the public to see the work, to be encouraged by the work, and I think that can be inspirational. And on the back of that, we very much suggest that whenever anyone, particularly we're doing projects, we try to make every opportunity to allow for visitors to come and get involved, as in owners, anyone really, to sort of encourage them to understand what goes on behind the scenes. I can't finish without mentioning, of course, some of the challenges. I would say that the biggest challenge that we get every time when we ask owners, what is it that you find a problem, is finding suitably qualified, experienced contractors. it is a problem. It's an industry-wide problem. It's certainly a problem in the UK. There are lots of building contractors out there, but as soon as the excited owner who's read all the books and definitely wants to do the best for his site says, oh, and I need you to use traditional techniques and I want you to use traditional materials that will be sympathetic to the building and allow it to breathe, and he's faced with contractors who sort of say, oh, well, we don't usually do that. We could probably do some cement, but, you know. So one of our biggest challenges at the moment that we're working with is what we call our Skills for the Future project. We're developing new training modules that are being rolled out this year across all of the construction industry schooling that takes place within Wales, encouraging the standard programmes to have modules about traditional skills and traditional building. They might not necessarily get quite to the level of these. These are some of our own masons. But again, we're leading by example. We're creating the modules and supporting their take-up. We're also bringing new apprentices into our own teams of conservators, and whenever we fund or give grant aid to anybody else's projects, we encourage them also to give jobs to apprentices, to people who are just coming into the business, so that they can learn those skills and complete their qualifications. And we hope that in this way we can support owners and volunteers throughout our country to actively engage with their building and its conservation. Thank you.